That's right. That's right. Back to the sickest podcast setup on the planet, on the internet. Joe Rogan, I'm coming for you. Still using the Mishimoto catch can box. Episode number 6. Let's get it popping. So I had a couple of people DM me this morning. I sent out a story saying, what do you guys want to hear me talk about on the podcast today? And a couple of people reached out and said, we want to hear. They were both very similar. One was like, when have you taken a build too far? And I think the other one was, what's the worst decision you've made on a build? So I'm going to kind of try and combine these because there's a lot to talk about on this topic, especially when it comes to someone who is in my position, who like kind of does this for a living versus other people who, are just doing it as a hobby. I still kind of say that I'm doing it as a hobby. I'm just documenting it with you guys, kind of getting your input and getting your feedback and criticism and all that. So when it comes to modifying cars, there are two types of people, right? There are types of people that love to modify, types of people that hate modifying. They just want a stock car. They buy that car for it to be a stock car. And actually, my friend Mike Slow Speed was in town the other day. We were making a video. He had brought up a really good point where, because he had a 435 with a big turbo on it, did everything to that car, everything that he could, and was having nothing but problems with the car. He would say that it was a big turbo build with big problems, right? Which is true. That's exactly what that build was. But he was, he had a full custom big turbo kit. The whole thing was, what's that paint, something tech paint, where it's like temporary paint. He had the whole thing in like lime green. He did a lot to it. He went like really far with that car, where he was just kind of having issues over and over again with it. Ended up getting rid of it, got into a new M340, which, might I add, is a sick car. I got to drive it the other day. You get to a point with some of these builds where you overbuild them, and for someone like me who doesn't have, a shop or a house to store cars, I have 2 garages, but really only one that I can use for a car. It doesn't really make sense for me to build up cars to the point where I can't daily drive them, because the whole purpose of building these cars, in my opinion, is functionality. So like, I want a fast car, but I also want a car that I can, take to do errands on my daily. And I think that that's the most relatable kind of build, because that's what most people are doing out here. And, even if I did wide body the Supra, which I might, I would still want it to be a functional, daily drivable car. Now, would a wide body make it more difficult to daily drive it? Yeah, probably. But I still think it would be doable, because I'm not someone that has to go to an office. So like my reality of daily driving a car is much different than someone else's reality who has, a 9-to-5. So I definitely think that you can take some of these cars too far. And, I saw that start to happen with my M2, and I definitely saw that start to happen with the F30. I never really felt like the M3 got to that point. I felt like the M3 I didn't do that much to that car. I kept it relatively stock, and I really didn't do anything to the engine. I only put an intake on it. It was pretty much stock. So that car was very, very daily drivable, and it wasn't that low either. I think a lot of times when these cars, once you start making them incredibly low and they have carbon like all over them, that's kind of where they get to the point where they just become a hassle to drive in and out of parking lots, and you don't want to ruin it when you're on the freeway, like going on road trips, or when you're going to see your friends downtown and the roads aren't so great and maybe there's a lot of people around you. Like, you just don't want to take that car because you're afraid of it getting like bashed up and dinged up, and you want it to be in good shape. So I've kind of noticed that the more that I build out cars sometimes, the more that I just don't want to use them in other scenarios. And I think that there's a fine line there. Especially when it comes to performance and stuff. I think that, we kind of fool ourselves into thinking, well, I'll buy this car that maybe isn't as fast as this other model, but I'm just going to do a bunch of stuff to it, and then it will be worth it because it'll be faster than that other model that was maybe a little bit more money. I've come to learn that you should probably just wait and save up and buy the car that is faster, that you really want, and spend less money and time trying to make that one that isn't so fast. When it comes to a lot of the M cars, the reason those are such great cars is because of the chassis and the suspension that they're built on, and they handle just much differently. And that was something that I realized right away when I got my E90 M3. The way that car handled was insane, especially going from an the 328 F30 into the E90 M3. What a difference in a vehicle. But the F30, it was in my opinion, it was pretty built up. And everything that we added to the car, aftermarket parts, people need to understand that anytime you are putting aftermarket parts on your car, they aren't going to be perfect. They aren't going to fit amazingly well, unless you're out there spending thousands and thousands of dollars on even Shuri parts and, stuff like that, which that's where those kind of parts come into play. But a lot of people, they buy, for example, a $100 trunk lid spoiler, and then they get it and they're like, well, why isn't the weave perfect? Or why isn't the fitment A1? And they complain because they just bought, a BMW that at MSRP was a $60,000 car, and maybe they were able to get it for $20 now because of depreciation, and they don't understand why the parts and the cost of, maintaining it is so expensive. Because at the end of the day, you still bought a BMW, which is a luxury vehicle. So don't fool yourself. So I think that there just needs to be a general understanding that when you buy parts for your car, they're not going to be perfect. And you are, in a sense, degrading the value of the car overall. Modifications will never increase the value of any car. That's why I always keep my stock parts. Always. I never sell any of my stock parts. I always keep them. Because at the end of the day, I know that reselling a car, when you get rid of it, is more valuable with OEM parts than it is aftermarket. And there's more of a used resale community. There's a bigger resale community on used parts, like modifications, and I can recoup some of that money. So, Mike had mentioned, circling back, you should always just buy the car that he learned, because he built up this big 435 that was just problems, and then he bought this M340 that was really fast out of the gate. Always just save up and buy the car that is already fast, rather than trying to make the one that isn't fast very fast. Unless you have a lot of money and it is like your second car and you're okay with having it down and it is a project, I'm not removing project cars from this equation, because project cars are meant to be project cars. I think sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that our main car can be a project car. It probably shouldn't be that way. I mean, if you look at my Supra, the exterior is pretty much stock. The only thing with that car is it's probably too low. I will probably raise it up a little bit once my new wheels come and tires and stuff. I will raise it up just a little bit, because the front is just too low. It's not too big of a pain in the butt to drive right now, but I could see it kind of becoming that if I go too far with it. And I will inevitably put a front lip on it. But the lip I got is very, very subtle. All the carbon I'm doing on that car is very, very minimal. I'm not going crazy with it. I want to keep it as functional as possible. And I always err on the side of functionality now with my builds. The M2 is kind of getting to this point where it's a little bit different for me, because I work with a lot of companies and I try to promote their products and give everybody an idea of what's possible. So you'll see me go through a lot of different styles and modifications and parts. And it's not that I necessarily love that part, but someone out there might. And that's what's important to me, being able to show people the possibilities. I ran 4 different front lips on that car. I had a wing on it at one point. I had multiple trunk lid spoilers, different ones, M Performance, PSM, CS, wing, GTS wing. And some people, I don't think they really get that. They're you'll get a lot of heat. Even on my building the BMW M2 in 13 minutes video, the common question that you see in that video is, oh, you ruined it when you put a wing on it. But the funny thing about that is, if you watch the whole video, there's 5 different spoiler options on that car, and a lot of people didn't realize that I had a separate trunk, so that GTS wing was tied to another trunk. So I would just take the trunk off and put the stock trunk on and fit whatever trunk lid spoiler I had on there. But it didn't end with the GTS wing on there. So it was almost like they stopped watching it, the GTS wing. I think that the M2 was probably, as far as like daily driving, that was the one that kind of got out of hand, just because of how low it was and how aggressive the carbon fiber was on it. You know, I ended up with that Vorsteiner style lip on the front, which I loved the style of it. Like, I thought it looked the best, but it was so low. I mean, like, probably had that much room, like 1.5 inches, 2 inches maybe on the front. I hit everything. So I had like a backup Vorsteiner lip in my garage because I was just hitting everything. But it looked amazing. And, you know, the 18-inch tires gave it even, or 18-inch wheels with the big tires, like gave it a little bit lower of a presence as well. It was just a very low car. So it became hard to drive pretty much anywhere, you know, with these builds. When they get to this point where they start to go too far, you automatically think that you need another car because your main car has now become your project car. And that is kind of something that I've tried not to do with the Supra, because I just got really tired of building these cars the same way over and over again to where they can't be functional. You know, where I kind of felt like I was crossing the line with like the methanol kit that I just put in the car. For obvious reasons, you need to have methanol, you need to keep filling it. But the cool thing is it's not totally the case. I think that I kind of fooled myself in the beginning thinking that. And then once I understood methanol and understood that, you know, you can have different tunes, you just remove the methanol tune and then you don't need to fill the tank back up and just don't use the meth tank. That's an option as well. So it's not like you're stuck with methanol once you install it. You have options. I think that the M2 and the F30 were definitely the cars that went a little too far. The F30, I had done the M3, the F80 front control arms, the front lower control arms. And what that did was, while it handled a little bit better, I was like fooling myself. I was never going to get like an M3 handling car. Well, maybe it handled a little bit better, but nothing near the level of an M3. So it also moved the wheels up a little bit, like a 1/2 inch maybe. That sort of became a problem after a while. I was hitting, it started to rub a little bit on the inside, and it's just like one more thing. And then the trunk never fit well. I had a lot of issues with that Sabin carbon fiber trunk. You just can't take an entire trunk and make it out of carbon fiber and expect it to fit well. So, you know, me, relatively new to putting giant carbon fiber pieces like that on cars, I just was at this point where I was like, yeah, well, send it. Like, we'll just send it. We're just making a car. Like, we're making a project car. It's a show car now. But I definitely got to the point where I was like, this is annoying. Like, nothing is working. The trunk would unlatch all the time. The taillights didn't fit. They would come unsealed. Wiring issues with it because of the unseal and the water were getting there. And it just became one thing after another with that car. And all of that was because I was modifying the car. So like, I did that. That was my fault. So I definitely think that you can go too far with cars. It's a little bit different with me now because I build these cars for content and shows. If I go to a show, like, I want my car to stand out. And that's just my taste in building cars. I want my car to be different. And so I tend to go, you know, pretty crazy on the cars aesthetically and interior and, you know, engine as much as I can without sacrificing all of my daily driving activities. But I think that with the Supra, I'm kind of taking a different approach. I'm being a little bit more cautious about what I do to the exterior. Like I said, the car, you guys see it, it's pretty much stock. There's just a couple of carbon pieces. And in the past, I've done like everything carbon fiber, like right away, immediately. The nice part about the Supra is it just looks so aggressive already. You know, you can really drive that car stock, and it just has a great curb appeal to it. You don't really need a lot done to it aesthetically to make it look wild. Even though I'm not like the biggest fan of like the front of that car, I just think it looks kind of weird. I think when they're wide, they like wide bodied, they look like 10 times better. I think that's when that car really shines, and that's, you know, that's the goal with mine. But as far as like the biggest disappointments when it's come to adding parts, like the biggest failure, I guess, that I've had when it came to adding a part, So I don't know if I want to name any brands in this video because I hate shitting on other people's brands and companies, and it could have just been a fluke that like maybe I had received a defective part. So there was a company that I worked with on the E90 M3, and it was a suspension company, and it was a coilover setup. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to say anything else about it, but it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. And we had parts breaking when we were installing the coils on the car. It was very cheaply made, and I was recommended these parts by another person that I know that does YouTube. Ended up installing the coilovers and just was never happy with them. They rode really bad. They made a ton of noise. They were super loud. They were breaking on install. Parts of the coilovers were breaking physically, like snapping off stems on parts of the... It was all bad, man. It was all bad. And so I probably had those on for less than a month, and I took them off and for the most part threw them away. Like, I can't even sell these. They're horrible. But, they were $1,200, $1,300 coilovers, and they were supposed to be good. Now, 2 cars later, I have the Supra on KWV3s, and I don't know if I'll ever ride anything else. Those, hands down, the best suspension setup I've ever ran in my life. They're incredible. That was probably one modification where it felt catastrophic because it ruined everything with the car. It ruined the way that it drove. It ruined the daily driving aspect of it. It was really loud, so it sounded horrible. And just the overall experience of like breaking things on install was just a huge headache. Continuous issues with it, and I ended up going back to springs, just like an H&R spring setup, which is totally fine on that car. That would probably be the only part that I've installed on my car, any of my builds, that was catastrophic. That was, in my opinion, so bad that it ruined parts of driving the car for me. I'd say everything else that I've done to these cars was fine. I really didn't have too many issues. There was the splitter incident on the M2, which was 100% my fault because I should have chassis mounted the splitter. It was very stupid of me to not chassis mount a splitter, but you live and you learn. And I just didn't think. I was like, oh, I'm not gonna track the car yet. If I do take the M2 to the track, then I will chassis mount the splitter. But I was out data logging and I got up to like 130. And look, I had gone 130 before with the splitter on and I didn't have any issues. And the way that I had it mounted wasn't like wonky. It wasn't like ghetto or anything. But the issue wasn't so much the splitter. It was the GTS lip that the splitter was connected to was so flimsy underneath. Like the fiberglass was just, the way that it was made was not great. It was starting to fail. And so it literally ripped out the bottom of the entire GTS lip. Like it pulled the entire thing off. So the GTS lip, like the top portion, was still stuck onto my car, and the entire bottom half of the GTS lip and the splitter ripped off my car from all the downforce. You gotta understand, like downforce, hundreds of pounds when you're driving that fast. Thankfully, no one was on the road. Like, that was the biggest thing for me. I felt super guilty, like that could have been horrible. When it first happened, I saw the splitter fly off in my rearview mirror and go like 30 feet in the air while I was data logging at 130 miles an hour. And I was like, holy crap, that was insane. Like, you just laugh about it, like how crazy it was. But then after a little bit of time sat in and I thought about that, I felt really guilty because I could have seriously hurt someone. The fact that flew off the car, went that high, I was going that fast, luckily it was 7 a.m. and I was on a road that wasn't busy and I was out there by myself and there was no traffic. Luckily. I felt really stupid and I felt really, really guilty after that. And, now looking back, I take extra precautionary measures anytime I'm putting something like that on my car, because the last thing I want to do is be a fool and not think about the other people on the road. That could have been catastrophic and that could have been really bad. So I will say that was a big fail. That was definitely a big fail. Those are the only two things, though. Those are the only two parts that I've ever put on any of my cars. Now, I've progressively gotten into putting nicer parts on my cars as the builds have gone on, and I've acquired more sponsorships or partners, people I get to work with. When I had the F30, I didn't really put like the nicest parts on it, like the wheels were just alloy niche wheels, knockoff brand, basic spring setup, carbon parts that were just kind of cheap. I didn't really put that much money into it, which makes sense. The 328, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think it makes sense to put a ton of money into that car. But then when I moved to the E90 M3, I just didn't really do that much to that car. It just looked really good and drove fine, stock. I loved that car. But then moving into the M2, I kind of went a little bit further. I did some nicer parts on that car that I really liked. Dynon stuff, CSF, intercooler, stuff like that. Just kind of took it up to the next notch. And then when I went into and like the full Valvetronic exhaust system and downpipe and stuff. And then when I went into the Supra, I really, really made a point for this build to step it up and start putting parts in the car that I felt like were really good, like the KWV3s. And you guys will see the wheels I got. They're very nice wheels, nicest I've ever owned. And no one else on the planet has them because they're custom, which is just dope. But, like the full Valvetronic exhaust in gold, like things like that. The intake is AMS. It's $1,000 intake. Just trying to put like nicer parts on the car and kind of just take a little more pride in the parts that I'm putting on the car, I feel like. Some of these parts that I had put on my previous builds, I was just kind of like, whatever, put it on for content, you know what I mean? And with this one, I'm being a little bit more decisive about the parts that I put on and intentional and making sure that there's a certain quality level. Now, maybe I'm not selling as many parts advertising, but I'm building a better car. And that's kind of how I see it. And in the long run, I think that'll pay off more. When I put the intake on the Supra, I got some kids who were heated about that. And that because of the price of it, because of the fact that it was like a $900 intake, which isn't that much. I mean, if you think about it, even Churi is like 3 times that. So it's all about perspective, but it's always interesting to me when this goes back to my other point where I was talking about, the value of a car and putting certain parts on it that are very cheap. A lot of these kids who own BMWs now that are putting parts on them they've become conditioned to think that all of the parts should be cheap and should fit amazingly well and should be perfect. And that's just not realistic. And you have to have a bit of ingenuity. When it comes to installing these parts on cars, you have to have a bit of ingenuity. You have to be okay with modifying things. You have to be okay with getting a little bit dirty. Like, you can't just expect parts to be perfect all the time. And somehow this modification culture thinks that everything needs to be perfect all the time. I see it all the time in the forums. The things that people are, what up, bro? The things that people are complaining about, it's just like, bro, if you want everything to be perfect and you want everything to fit well all the time, don't modify your car. Like, this is just not the world for you. And I feel like the younger generation, damn, I feel like an old man right now talking about this, but I feel like the younger generation is kind of coming up in this world where they expect everything to be perfect and they expect to pay fractions, a fraction of the dollar on these modification prices, when that's just not the case. Back in the day when we were building Hondas and stuff, everything had to be modified. Nothing was perfect. A lot of times we made our own parts. Like, that was how it was. But now it's just a different culture, man. And a lot of these kids expect everything to be perfect all the time and expect it to be cheap. And so I thought that the reaction when I installed the AMS intake was really interesting, because kids were like, oh my God, he spent $900 on an intake. And it was never about, like, I know that an intake is not going to get me a lot of power. It was never about that. It's about putting quality parts into your car and being proud of that. When I go to a car show and I pop my hood, I didn't want a $300 MST intake in there. I wanted a nice intake that made an impact. I think that's the same reason that people put even Churi parts on their cars. I think we start to cross like a dangerous line when we're criticizing other people based on the parts they decide to put on their cars, because it could go both ways, right? Like someone buys a cheap intake, which is like $300, like, oh my God, you put a cheap intake on your car. You have no idea where that person is in life. Maybe that's all they can afford, you know? And now I've come a little bit further in this game and I can afford a $900 intake. I personally wouldn't buy a $2,400 intake. I think that that's too expensive, you know? But at the same time, like, who am I to decide? If someone makes a lot more money than me and they can afford that, then awesome, dude. It's a sick part. Like, congratulations. So oftentimes when you see someone complaining about what they put on their car, depending on like the price of it, they're just jealous because they can't afford that. Let's be honest. That's what that comes down to. Hey, no, God damn it. It's just like, these cats jump over everything. I can't. It's crazy, man. Living with these two cats is nuts. So I just think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting time to be building these cars and doing what I do, especially when you are in front of an audience on YouTube and everybody has something to say about what you do. I've personally never experienced more people that had an opinion on what someone other than themselves was doing, which is amazing to me, because there's clearly... Obviously, there are other people in the world that do things that I don't agree with, or I would do them differently, but never would I step out of my way to tell them that, or like tell them that they are doing it wrong in my opinion, or that I would have done it this way. It's just so, it just comes off as so snobby and like selfish and just, I don't know, man. Let people live their lives. Let them do what they want to do in life. You don't need to critique everything that you don't agree with. And, yeah, it's almost like people just have a hard time minding their own business. Like they can't even just allow people to live their lives anymore. We've gotten to this place where we can't even allow people to have their own opinions without, you know, people threatening their lives. Like it's a wild time to be alive. And you guys all know exactly what I'm talking about. The best that you can do, the best thing that all of you can do is ignore all of that and focus on yourself. And quit worrying about what anyone else is doing, because they are not important to your personal gains. All that matters is what you're doing. That's it. You know, love people, love your loved ones, spend time, work on your relationships, love yourself. Make sure that you're putting a lot of time into your self-worth and your self gains, and spend more time doing the things you love. And I think we need to be at a place where we aren't casting so much criticism and judgment on other people. It's just the nature of times right now. It doesn't matter what platform you're on. It's just how people are right now. Wow, I don't know how we got here. But it is the truth, and I see it more and more. And oh yeah, okay, so the intake thing, because people thought it was too expensive, and that's judgment. So that's kind of how we got here. But look, at the end of the day, you know, I think that the only couple of modifications that I did that I wouldn't have done all over again were the coilovers on the M3. They're cheap, but basically what I'm saying is don't cheap out on coilovers. And the splitter, basically what I'm saying there is if you're going to put a splitter on your car, make sure that you chassis mount it. Also, people who put front lips on their cars, please start using bolts. Self-tapping screws and 3M is not enough. You need bolts, like a physical bolt that goes through, and then a nut and some washers on the other side. Do that for me. At least two of them. Use at least two on every lip that you put on. That's also another one. I see people with like lips hanging off their cars, and could have been so easily avoidable. So random podcast today. I was just firing off questions this morning to see what people wanted me to talk about. Someone had mentioned talk about modifications that you regret or maybe went too far. I think we kind of covered that and covered a little bit about, you know, is it easy to go too far with builds? I also made like a full YouTube video about this at one point. I think it was when I had the M2, like near the end. And that was definitely where I was at the point where this car, like, I was just like, this car is just gone too far. Someday I will get a daily. I did have plans to get a daily driver before I bought the Supra, and I kind of put those plans on hold because I don't have room for one, and I don't need one. And I'm trying to be in this place right now in life where I'm not buying things that I don't need. It's easy to kind of fall into this, when you start making a little more money in life, it's easy to fall into this like rhythm where you start buying stuff you don't need and you don't even realize you do it. And so every now and then I sort of I call it like I purge my life, where I go through everything that I own and I really ask myself, okay, how is this benefiting me as a person? And how often do I use it? And do I really need it? And I think everyone should do this. I think everyone should purge their life every now and then. I'm not telling you to be a minimalist by any means. I'm not a minimalist. I have things. But I do think it's really important that you get to a point where you don't let all of your material stuff kind of overtake you and like become you, because that's very much so a thing. And I can feel like sometimes I just feel like I have too much stuff, like too many things. I gotta like purge. Usually in the winter and like spring, I end up doing that. Like right before winter, and then usually in the spring, I'll go through like a phase where I kind of just purge everything: clothes, furniture, just random stuff that I have around the house, car parts, stuff like that. So that helps. And if you're anything like me and you are out here building cars and maybe you start making a little more money in life, you start acquiring more things, you get into this position where you just have a lot of stuff that you don't need, and it's good to get rid of it. And you just feel a lot better too. I feel like you kind of hit reset and you get a little more purposeful about what you buy after that. Anyways, you guys, this episode was number 6. I'm still trying to get these podcasts up on Apple. Trying to make it happen faster because I have a lot of people asking to get these on Apple. So clearly there's an audience there. I'm going to do my best to make that happen. Number 7 coming at you hot. I kind of like these podcasts because I don't plan anything. I just kind of like go off the cuff, and if it's Thursday and I want to make one, I make one. The YouTube side of stuff on Thick Whips is a little more like scheduled and very regimented, and I feel like this isn't, which I enjoy. There's like a little bit of madness to it where it's not so structured, and that's also, I think that there's like a bigger part of that too, where in life not everything needs to be structured. It's good to have some spontaneity, and yeah, so that's why I really like this podcast. Sometimes we can just get on here and shoot the shit and talk. And that's really cool to me, and I appreciate that a lot. So thank you to everyone who's been watching. It's not like we have like a huge audience on this channel yet, but it has been really fun and kind of opened up a new side of me creatively and just venting. I think it's good for everyone to do. You guys should all start a podcast, honestly. We'll have a whole episode about that. Anyways, I'm ranting. I'm going to get out of here. Love you guys. Boosh.